Hello, church family. Welcome to today's Sunday school lesson. We are in session 13, the final lesson in this quarterly entitled Trust. And our key idea this week is believers find joy through trusting God in all circumstances. And we're in Acts chapter 27, verses 31 through 44. And we're going to start by asking the question, how do you respond when confronting serious problems? And what makes it difficult to trust God in every circumstance? For me, whenever a serious problem comes up, I tend to get quiet. I tend to become reserved and begin thinking. I know that when I'm stressed, I can often lash out, and I don't want to do that. So I try to remain quiet and calm. And but others, they might get frantic, they might get panicked. I try not to be that way, but I definitely feel the stress. I begin sweating, I begin getting cold palms or clammy palms and cold feet about certain things. And I mean physically cold feet, not cold feet in that I'm hesitating to make a decision. Anyway, but I don't often have these kinds of reactions because I do my best to see the positivity in all circumstances. Now, obviously, that is not possible in every circumstance, that to immediately see the positive. But I do try to. I do endeavor to do that. So, what makes it difficult to trust God in these circumstances? Well, we often have trouble trusting the Lord in these circumstances because we can only see what's right in front of us. We can't see the good. We can't see how we're going to get out of this. We can't see the hope in the situation. And we're going to be looking at Paul shipwrecked on the island of Malta and how he urged the men with him, the prisoners and jailers and Roman centurions alike, to trust in the Lord, that God would get them through the shipwreck that they were experiencing. So many people respond in two ways: fight or flight. Either they attack that problem head on. They might get a little angry or aggressive. That might not be the right word, but they don't wait. They don't wait around. Others will tend to flight or to run away, to flee from the problems. Whatever the situation, though, believers have a third option, which is faith, to trust in the Lord. Even though we may be frightened, we may be angry, we may be stressed out, we can trust in the Lord because He loves us and He's sovereign, He's in control. And so, as Paul wrote to the Roman Christians, God works in all things for the good of those who love Him and who are called according to His purpose. So, Paul, like I said, he's on his way from Caesarea, where he was imprisoned by Felix and then Festus, and had met in front of Agrippa that we looked at last week. And now he is going to be transferred to Caesar because he had appealed to Caesar. And because he had appealed to Caesar and the letters had been written and all of that kind of stuff, he had to go to Rome. And so he's going to Rome. He's excited about going and witnessing to Caesar and getting to take Christianity away from just Jerusalem and Asia Minor, but into Rome and what would eventually become Europe and the heart of the Roman Catholic Church in the future. So anyway, they become shipwrecked. They go through a bad storm and they are stranded, and they tried to get control of the ship, and they began throwing cargo overboard. And this happened for 14 days. This took place over 14 days of struggle, of fighting the storm, and the sailors weren't eating because they were trying to preserve the food just in case. And Paul finally said in verse 31, let's pick up here, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved." Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head." After he said these things and had taken some bread, he gave thanks to God in the presence of all of them, and after he broke it, he began to eat. They all were encouraged and took food for themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. So we know that Dr. Luke is is part of this company that is with Paul on his way to Rome. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could. After cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that held the rudders. Then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable. So they ran into a sandbar and lodged the ship into the sand. So they're not quite to the shore yet. They can still see the shore, but there is water between the sandbar and the actual shore of the island that they don't know what island this is yet. The bow remained jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. So they got stuck, and then there were just waves crashing over the ship, and it's just breaking up the back of the ship and the rear of the ship. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape, but the centurion kept them from carrying out this plan because he wanted to save Paul. So he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks and some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. So Julius, the name of the centurion, and this is mentioned earlier than our text says here, but his name is Julius, and he intervened and saved Paul, and in saving Paul and all the prisoners, he saved everyone. But first, we see this call to trust, and we see that in verses 31 through 34. Paul said to the centurion, again named Julius, he was the one in charge. He was the officer on deck. He was the one responsible for Paul and the other prisoners. And he actually treated Paul with kindness on this trip to Rome. So unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut the ropes holding the skiff and let it drop away. So there were some men trying to escape on a lifeboat. And Paul said, wait, don't let them, because if they go out in the lifeboat in this storm, they will die. They will drown. So they cut the ropes holding the skiff and they let it drop away. So they got rid of the lifeboat. When it was about daylight, Paul urged them all to eat food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have been waiting and going without food, having eaten nothing. Sorry, I can't speak tonight. So I urge you to take some food, for this is for your survival, since none of you will lose a hair from your head. So they had gone 14 days without eating. So this is a 2-week-long storm. That's a long time for a storm to rage and rage and rage. And because of all of the fighting of the storm and making sure all of the different parts of the ship are manned, they didn't have a spare second to eat. And so these men were exhausted. These men were probably on the brink of starvation. They were expending their energy. They were straining against the storm. Sailing is already hard work whenever conditions are good. And so sailing in these terrible stormy conditions, it is just wrecking these men. And it seems like they are anchored down while the storm is going on, but they are still having to fight the storm. They're having to do things with the sails and do things with the ship to keep it from capsizing or going under or causing it to sink in any way. So, but Paul had assured, but an angel had assured Paul that he would get to Rome before this passage, back in verse 21 through 26. And so he had confidence to go ahead and eat so that he had the energy for the swim to shore later. And then the word there for salvation in verse 34 is the Greek word soterios. And so Paul may have been using wordplay because it means salvation, not just survival. So salvation and survival there share that word. And so Paul may have been using that word intentionally, soterios, to speak about the salvation not only of their physical bodies, but of their heavenly bodies, their spiritual lives being saved because of Paul's testimony of Jesus. And so he was hopeful that they would become saved after this, that they would believe in Christ after this. So this is our call to trust. So what makes God worthy of our trust? Well, first off, God is sovereign. God is in charge of everything. He is in charge of the wind and the waves and the storm and time and sickness. And we've gone through this on Sunday mornings before, how Jesus was the Lord of all of these things. He's Lord over evil. He's Lord over health or sickness. He's Lord over time. He's Lord over death. He's Lord over all of these things. Well, God is as well. And if God is in charge, then we can trust in him to get us out of whatever situation that we're in. But on top of that, not only is God in charge, because you could have someone who's in charge who is also evil and is wanting you to go through suffering and go through pain and go to death. But God is perfectly good. God is good in all of the things that he does. So even if the things that he allows are bad, God promises to redeem those things. And even in the midst of bad circumstances and terrible diagnoses and terrible storms and shipwrecks, God is still in control and God is still good. And so we can trust in him because of this. That's what makes him worthy of our trust, that he is trustworthy. I know that sounds redundant, but that is true. God is worthy of our trust because he has proven himself to be trustworthy for us. So then Paul calls them to act in faith. This is verses 35 through 38. After he said these things and had taken some bread and gave thanks to God, in the presence of all of them, he broke it and he began to eat. They were all encouraged and took food for themselves. In all, there were 276 of us on the ship. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship and began by throwing the grain overboard into the sea. So how is stopping to eat an act of faith? How was that an act of faith? Well, they are saying, to heck with this storm, we're going to eat. We're going to take a second and eat and trust that God is going to keep this ship from capsizing while we get a little bit of something to eat, a little snack, a little meal, so that we can rejuvenate our energy to fight the storm some more or to at least get to shore. And so Paul led by example when he broke the bread and gave thanks for it in front of all of them. He didn't go and hide in a cabin somewhere on the ship. He didn't go and hide below decks. He stayed above deck or at least wherever they were at on the ship, and he broke the bread, he gave thanks, and he ate. And so Paul showed them that it's okay to have faith and to eat a little bit to keep your energy up. So when have you stepped out in faith, trusting God to provide for your needs? When I moved to Emory, I knew that I was moving into a situation that was much more financially stable than what I had been living in previously. When I was in Avenger, I made $1,000 a month. It was good for me. I had a place to live, and all I really needed was to buy groceries and gas. I didn't have rent. The church utilities covered my utilities there in my little cottage in Avenger. But I didn't have any savings to speak of. I didn't have first month's rent and last month's rent and the money for all of my utilities to be turned on when I moved to Emory. But I didn't let that stop me. And because of the faithfulness of Emory Baptist Church, not only to me, but to the Lord, you guys took care of all of those things for me when I moved to Emory in 2019. I was able to move, and last month's rent was paid for me. That was taken care of. All of my utility bills were able to be turned on, and all of this done before I ever led a second of worship as a full-time employee of Emory Baptist Church, which was such a blessing to me, because that was a big change. When I moved to Emory, my rent at my house in the Katy edition was almost as much as my previous salary. There was no way I could have paid the $1,600 and whatever it would have been, $1,700 that I would have owed for first and last month's rent. There's no way I could have paid that. But because of the generosity of Emory Baptist Church and her members, I was able to move to Emory and take that step of faith, knowing that God would provide for me, and he did. So how have you taken a step of faith? Another way that I have, and this is not just for me to brag, just to give an example, when I went to college, I had every intention of starting my college education to as a pre-med major to become a doctor. I've talked about this before. And then when I got the call to ministry, it was like the day before I had to clear the business office at East Texas Baptist. I had to have all my money lined up to clear the business office to enroll in all my classes. And I'm changing my major because I felt the call to ministry, to full-time vocational music ministry. And I told my dad, and so he and I drove to Marshall and we met with some folks and got everything changed over. And because of my step of faith, God provided all of the money necessary and even more than what I had expected to get as a student of the School of Science there at ETBU. I was given more scholarship money going to the School of Music. And so God just stepped in and opened that door and allowed me to do what I was called to do. And that is just a great example of how God's faithfulness to me has allowed me to get to where I am today. And then finally, we're looking at persistent trust. This is the last 6 verses here, verses 39 through 44. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. They planned to run the ship ashore if they could after cutting loose the anchors. So they were anchored down, or they were at least had anchors on board. And so they cut them loose, and they left them in the sea. And at the same time, they loosened the ropes that held the rudders. They hoisted the foresail to the wind and headed for the beach, but they struck a sandbar and ran the ship aground. The bow jammed fast and remained immovable, while the stern began to break up by the pounding of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners so that no one could swim away and escape, but the centurion kept them from carrying out this plan because he wanted to save Paul, and so he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and get to land. The rest were to follow, some on planks, some on debris from the ship. In this way, everyone safely reached the shore. So there in verse 39, their best bet for getting to shore was the ship because it floated. And men didn't always float very well. And if they didn't know how to swim, they had a lower chance of making it to shore than if they were just to be able to float the boat in and run it aground closer into shore. So they had this plan, but God was in control. And so the situation would still play out to God's purposes. So they cut loose these 4 anchors. Roman ships had 4 anchors, 2 on the front, 2 on the rear. But by removing the anchors, they were able to sail the ship. So they were probably anchored offshore to try to fight that storm, so that the waves wouldn't pick them up and take them further out to sea. This way they could stay in one place or relatively close to one place and keep themselves relatively close. So they cut the anchors. They didn't even hoist them back up so that they could save the weight so that they could get in faster. They sailed or they hoisted the foresail to the wind, so they caught the wind, and they were full sails ahead here. But they struck the sandbar, and the bow jammed fast. It means it got stuck. They hit it, and it drove the bow of the ship so far into the sand that it just wedged there and stuck there. There was not water around it, and so the weight of the boat was just resting on basically dry ground, that dry sand of that sandbar. And so then the shipwreck actually happens here. There in verse 41, the stern began to break up. So the ship was no longer seaworthy. The boards and the planks of the rear of the ship were busting up and breaking up. And so the ship was deteriorating quickly. And so they had to get off of the ship. And Paul had predicted this about 20 verses earlier. He predicted that they were going to be shipwrecked. But that was now coming to pass. And then we saw there the plan to kill the prisoners, but Julius saved the prisoners. So, how did God protect the passengers even when the sailors' best efforts did not work out as they planned? Well, they were able to get to a sandbar. And if you've ever been to Destin, if you've ever been to Galveston, there's a sandbar. Most beaches have these where the sandbar is several hundred yards, maybe several hundred yards offshore, but it is exactly what it sounds like, a shallow area of sand that has been mounded up so that where it's deep on one side and deep on the other, that sand across the top is very shallow. It's actually only probably 4 or 5 feet deep in a lot of places. And so the ship got wedged there. So the men could actually jump out of the ship and be able to stand on solid ground, at least for a moment, before they swam all the way to shore. They weren't jumping off the ship into hundreds of feet of water. They were jumping off the ship into, at most, probably 6 or 7 feet of water, enough depth that they would have to tread, or they might be able to rest a little easier, knowing that they might not drown, but they were having to swim. And so then they swam, and God got them to shore safely. And then God also, because of the compassion that he gave Julius toward Paul, he saved all of the prisoners, because the plan originally was to get rid of the prisoners so that they would not escape and run away. But Julius put an end to that because of his compassion toward Paul. And so, what spiritual disciplines, in the light of all of this, what spiritual disciplines or habits have helped you to trust God in the face of ongoing difficulty? I think the biggest one for us is to remember to read our Bibles, to remember to read about God's faithfulness. We can look at Job, we can look at Moses, we can look at Noah, and see these stories in the Old Testament of God's faithfulness to his chosen people, to his chosen lineage of Israel. Then we can turn around and look at the New Testament and see God's faithfulness to us in the fulfillment of prophecy in the Messiah, in Jesus. And we can see how he never planned for any of mankind, not just Israel, but any of mankind, to go unsaved. He had a plan from the very beginning for all of mankind to come to know him. That's what he desires. And we know that's not going to happen, that not literally every person will be saved, but God does desire every man, woman, and child to be saved and to know him personally. That's what he created us for. He created us to worship him. And because of that, why would he have a cruel disposition toward us? If he created us to know him and created us to worship him, then why would God be cruel toward us? He's not cruel toward us. We live in a broken, sinful world. So where it seems that God is not there, or God is even evil because of the things that are happening, war, genocide, natural disasters that kill hundreds of thousands of people like the tsunamis have in the past 20 years, those things, you look at it and you go, how can there be a good God? Or how can there be a God that allows this to happen? And if he does allow this to happen, how could he be anything other than evil? Well, the thing is, brothers and sisters, that the occurrence of bad things does not imply an evil creator. It implies an evil, sinful creation that happened when Adam and Eve sinned in the garden and they fell far from grace. And then we're born into sin, yes, but then we also sin by choice every time we disobey those that are closest to us. Every time that we say a little white lie, every time we take something that is not ours, or we say a harsh word to our spouses, or we do things that are considered sin, anything that breaks the 10 Commandments, anything that goes against God's law, or anything, what we tell Kids Praise Kids and VBS kids, what sin is anything that breaks God's law or makes him unhappy, makes him sad. That is sin. And because we are sinners by birth and sinners by choice, we live in a world that is fallen. And in the midst of that, God is still faithful. He was faithful to Adam, he was faithful to Noah and Moses and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob before Moses, and to the nation of Israel all through the Bible, even when they were the most disobedient to him. God was still faithful to them. He tried to get their attention through the conquering of Israel by other nations. He tried to get their attention through judges and kings and prophets, and they refused to listen. And so he finally sent Jesus as the ultimate sacrifice, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles, not just for the nation of Israel, but for you and I as well. And so that is the overarching picture of our lesson today, is that God's faithfulness and God's provision for us is solid all the way through, bar none, period, the end. And I hope that's encouraging to you. Thank you so much for being with me today. I look forward to worshiping you with you very soon.